Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Prime Sports Network podcast. We have a little bit of an emergency podcast here today. There has been news dropped within the sports world, specifically the Seahawks world. Per Bob Condata, a trusted Seahawks reporter, the Seattle Times has learned that the Seahawks are expected to part ways with defensive coordinator Ken Norton Jr. and defensive pass coordinator Andre Curtis. In an episode that we posted earlier today, which, by the way, you should go check that out, we spoke about how we just dislike him and we think that we should move on from him because he hurts our team and we're tired of him. So to see this finally happen, our blessings have been heard, prayers have just been answered, and we are now blessed to move on from this just feel like defensive drought, and we can finally move on to bigger, better things. And I'm gonna let Brayden take it away from here.
First things first. Let's fucking go.
Absolutely.
Let's fucking go. We talked about it so much. Me and you personally, not even on here, have expressed our anger and hatred for Ken Norton. His defensive scheming is horrible. But we're not talking about him anymore. We're talking about
Hmm.
what what are the Seahawks going to do? Now, also from reports say that Clint Hurt, who is the D-line coach, he's the most likely candidate to get the job. And in all reality, I'm completely fine with that, simply because you look at what the D-line has been able to do. Now, Hurt has been able to make players like Darrell Taylor, like Alton Robinson, like Poona Ford, like Al Woods. He gets the most out of his players, and I really like that. The Seahawks defensive line hasn't been the greatest, but at the same time, look at the guys that Hurt's been given. He's been given a pretty old Carlos Dunlap, and he turned him from having one sack with the Bengals to basically having nine the entire season. He made Poona Ford great. He's made Al Woods. He had a revitalized season this year. That was also something that we mentioned in the last podcast. Other guys have stepped up. He's developed Darrell Taylor and Alton Robinson. As I just said, Rasheem Green really broke out this year. So I think that Hurt is probably the safest choice and definitely a name that I will be completely fine with if we do inevitably promote him to the defensive coordinator. The other name that has been mentioned was Ed Donatel, who is the Broncos defensive coordinator who just got fired. That is a name that I would also not mind too much because the Broncos defense was a defense coming into 2021 that I really liked. They were who I drafted in fantasy football because I liked who they had, and I don't necessarily think it's because of the defensive coordinator. I just think that the personnel that they had was super good, especially in that secondary. They had Justin Simmons, Kareem Jackson, Patrick Surtain, Kyle Fuller, and they had signed Ronald Darby. So I think that that secondary is just absolutely loaded, and so is that pass rush with Von Miller and Bradley Chubb. But since they traded away Von Miller, that's besides the point. I don't think that Donatel is the right guy because he's really only seen success when he has such a stacked positions group. So I'd be completely fine with Clint Hurt, and I'm just gonna let Tino uh, take it away.
So, first off, like Braden said at the beginning, we have been calling for this since 2019, correct?
I'd
I
say about we really started getting on the fire Ken Norton train. I'd say about week 7 of 2020.
That's very specific and very true.
It was after the
Uh,
Bills game.
oh yeah, I do remember that. Yeah, because then I'm pretty sure right after that I made
Hmm.
on Twitter I made my profile picture a picture of Ken Norton's face, and I put big text over his face saying "fire him." And I got a decent amount of people on Twitter to change it to the profile picture because everybody was just sick and tired of the guy. I mean, how can you not be mad when, like, okay, I got some numbers here. Just even this past season, Seattle has allowed 379 yards per game, which is the second highest mark in franchise history. But we did
I'm
finish
assuming first was 2020.
well, yeah. I mean, would be surprised. Finished 11th in the league in points allowed with 21.5. It's not terrible, but I feel like that,
He
we
gets
had
bailed
some
out by high end talent.
exactly, exactly. And then last season, the Seahawks were 22nd in yards, but 15th in scoring. The stats don't lie, and even watching, this dude, he he's been he's been the imposter. The dude does not need a job anywhere else because I fear for any team he goes to next if he's going to be a DC again. I don't think he deserves it. He didn't do a good job at all. And it's unfortunate, but I'm so happy to move on. This moment right here kind of reminds me of whenever we fired Brian Schottenheimer. I just kind of like I didn't know how to feel, but this I've just kind of drastically different because I didn't care too much for Brian, but I didn't like him completely. I didn't have a huge problem with him, but I guess I'm glad he's gone because I didn't like him here and there. But now Ken, different story. So I'm a little all over the place because we can finally get newer, better, just defensive schemes and minds. And I know you mentioned what's it, Clint Hurt,
Yep.
Clint Hurt, defensive line coach. I'm totally down for it. Did he have any past coaching anywhere else?
I mean, yeah, he's obviously had to coach in other areas. He has not been a defensive coordinator yet, though.
Okay. Well, that would be an interesting ordeal. I will be content with it if he just doesn't drop any of his linemen into coverage. I
I
am
think
completely fine with it.
I think he's a guy who, especially coming from a defensive line, I think he would be the first guy to admit that they should be absolutely nowhere near in coverage. So
No.
I feel like he would be the perfect guy to say, no, none of these boys are dropping back.
Yeah, they like every time you saw that happen, Benson Mayoa might have gotten two like passes defended, but after that, they're just dropping back for no. They're just a body, and they're
Hmm.
wasting their just being on the field. They're wasting the amount of players we can have on the field that each time he's not applying pressure, and he's sure as hell isn't guarding anybody
Nope.
because even the quarterback will just throw it right to the dude Benson Mayo is on or Alden Robinson because they're not gonna stop that.
Nope.
Like why even bother? So I, I'm very, very happy with this. And um, now moving on to what's next. You mentioned Clint Hurt, Ed, Ed who?
Ed Donatel.
Ed Donatel. Any? What other names did you mention?
I have not mentioned any other names, but just writing down some names, doing some quick research before we started this. I wrote down Terrell Austin. He is the secondaries coach for the Pittsburgh Steelers. His name has been thrown around a lot in recent years for defensive coordinator jobs. Um, like we said, Clint Hurt is by far the most likely, but Austin is somebody who I would also not mind. They have Minka Fitzpatrick, Joe Hayden. They revitalized his career there. They have other cornerbacks. Like the Steelers' secondary play has been really good, especially when that run defense has just been absolutely atrocious. Other guys, James Bettish, he is the D line coach from the 49ers. We saw the Seahawks steal Shane Waldron from the Rams. That could be another name that we could possibly poach. The Niners defensive line extremely good Nick Bosa, not DeForest Buckner anymore because they traded him. Ha! Eric Armstead, Javon Kinlaw, host of other names there. That could be a name that we could possibly poach. He was a former defensive coordinator for the Cardinals as well. That could be somebody. And then Gerard Mayo, his name has been thrown around a lot in head coaching jobs, but I could possibly see him taking a defensive coordinator role instead, simply because he hasn't been a coordinator yet, so it would be kind of risky for him to go straight up to being a head coach. I think he'd obviously have to take it if he got that job offered to him. But if he doesn't get a head coaching job, I could definitely see him taking a defensive coordinator spot. And I think Mayo's a guy that he was a really good player for the Patriots. I remember watching him, and that would just be somebody that I wouldn't necessarily mind. But outside of those names, Clint Hurt is probably the most likely and probably my favorite to get the job. But outside of them, I would say that my number one external non-head coach hire would be Terrell Austin, that secondary guy from Pittsburgh. And then to just kind of continue to ramble on, former head coaches that I could see become defensive coordinators would be Vic Fangio, Mike Zimmer, and Matt Patricia. I wrote his name down kind of just as a joke, but I do not want Matt Patricia, but he might be in the running to get a coordinator job this year. I highly doubt it though. Fangio and Zimmer, those were the two guys that I mentioned in the last episode. I would really like Vic Fangio, and the Seahawks seem to be inclined to go towards a Broncos guy if it is going to be an external hire. Again, it's just a matter of do Fangio and Zimmer want to take the job because they are really old and they're more likely to just retire, I would assume. So those would be two guys that I'd really like. I think Fangio would be the better of the two, but again, Mike Zimmer would also not be a name that I wouldn't mind.
I I look at the Cowboys and what they pulled with Dan Quinn. I knew when Dan Quinn went to the Cowboys as their DC.
Hmm.
Okay, we're not going to talk about the playoffs, but
That
he
wasn't his
did
fault.
well. Yeah, it wasn't his fault, but I knew he was going to be good. Getting back into his groove as a DC, he did just fine as a head coach too. I mean, it's just losing that Super Bowl kind of crushed him, and so after
Hmm.
that he was kind of on a downslope, and so then he got back in his lane at DC at the Cowboys, and he's honestly just been cracking off. So I I have little knowledge right now of some of these names that you've listed off, and I'll admit it. As far as the internal and some of these other DCs and stuff, one of the names that really intrigues me though is that Pittsburgh secondary coach. What was his
Terrell
name again?
Austin.
Terrell Austin. I'm gonna be completely honest. The Seahawks have never really been a defensive line, you know, big big guys up front type of defense. We've always been a secondary type of defense,
Hmm.
and I feel like if and it would complement Pete Carroll because I know that with an internal hire, it's just gonna be Pete just bitch slapping the dude around like
He's
he's
just
his
going to be
bitch.
another yes man.
Yeah, exactly. So we need we need something fresh. We need something new, but we also need something that'll satisfy Pete. And uh, something that will satisfy Pete is obviously secondary. Uh, like a good secondary. I know he loves it, and it's not like it's not as old as him. So he intrigues me the most out of all of the names that you listed. Um, I wouldn't mind a former head coach, uh, but you said is Vic Fangio the youngest out of all of them?
I think Zimmer or Patricia would be the youngest, but we're not hiring him.
No,
No.
I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm good.
Yeah.
No thanks.
I think Zimmer's younger than Fangio.
Well, yeah. I mean, between the two, I would have to say Zimmer gets a job before Fangio.
Hmm.
So honestly, I take Zimmer just because, and I that's why I mentioned Dan Quinn earlier. Uh, head coach, former head coaches that got to get back, back in their groove. Fall back to DC or OC on a different team, get a good year in, get some nice, some nice stats going, so that they can pursue a head coaching job somewhere else the following season or in a couple seasons after that. So I wouldn't mind Zimmer, that Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer looking motherfucker. I have a picture in my phone of the post game of the Seahawks Vikings in 2019. I'm pretty sure
No, we
when
didn't.
we
The only time that
or
we played the Vikings in the postseason was the coldest
no, not
game.
postseason. It was regular season.
Oh, it
It was
was
a
regular
Sunday
season.
night.
Yeah, it was that
Yeah.
Sunday night game where they literally had a 99.9% chance of winning.
And we came back and won, and yeah, so I have I have a picture of my TV with that dude. Like, I swear his nose gets so red, and I just, I keep that for keepsakes in case any Vikings fans piss me off. Um, but luckily for them, they got rid of him, and I mean, I wouldn't mind him. I like a little bit of that. But some of the you I know you talked to me about it before we started the podcast. Two specific people would be, just dream
Cam and
scenarios.
Sherm,
Br-
baby.
get Bam Bam Cam, get that motherfucker Cam Chancellor on the DC, get him on the phone, cause like I look at Twitter and he tweets during like Seahawks games and he's like he'll
Hold
just
on.
talk about it.
Okay, I just thought of something, just off the
What?
top of my head. If we're going to have Clint Hurt have to be promoted to the DC, we're still going to have an internal hire, and it's probably going to have to be a D-lines coach. Cliff Averill.
Oh my gosh, yes, dude. Bring in Cliff. Yes, dude. Bring in
Yes,
Cliff. Dude, it's yeah, like I swear it's Cliff and
Cam.
I keep wanting to say Bam Bam. I mean, it's his nickname, but I keep seeing Cliff and Cam just always like back and forth on Twitter about,
Hmm.
some of the some of the mistakes Ken Norton's doing. Like, they blatantly said like,
Yeah,
"Yeah, our defense is not good."
and I
And
don't think it's due to a lack of talent. It's
no,
skill.
it is not. It is not. Nowhere near. And like, he knows what he's talking about, and he's been with the team. He knows the rigmarole of the team, and so I mean, Cam Chancellor, excellent candidate.
Hmm.
Dream scenario per se. Just like, another perfect and cool scenario would also have to be Richard Sherman if he were to retire this offseason, but I don't think he plans on retiring.
Eh.
I would like to see him retire because I just don't want him to ride on that bandwagon of the Bucks retirement home over there and then me dislike him more and more for, backstabbing us. I love him to death, and I know he still lives in Seattle full time, so it would just it would work out in every way, and not to mention even both the guys between Cam Chancellor and Richard Sherman, former players in the Legion of Boom, top 3 to top 5 defense of all time. What who's to say that they don't know how to coach a defense?
Hmm.
I
I
mean,
mean,
they're their own biggest critics.
Deshaun Shed, who was a corner after Byron Maxwell left for the Eagles, he is a defensive assistant. He's a cornerbacks coach right now, basically. So he already has a job in the organization. So, and I know with the firing of Andre Curtis as well, like we're still going to be looking for a defensive passing game coordinator. So that, like, while we do say Cam as a defensive coordinator jokingly, that like he legitimately could be somebody, like if he wanted to, he could very well come in and take over for the defensive passing game coordinator very well, because he would be leading that secondary basically. And I think that he's somebody who would legitimately do a good job at that. And I think if we were to promote Clint Hurt, you bring in Cliff Averill, or I don't like Michael Bennett. Maybe you bring in Michael Bennett,
Bring in
but
Bruce Irvin.
possibly. Um, but no, like Cliff Averill was, I would say, one of my favorite parts of the Legion of Boom, who is vastly just unmentioned by the majority of people because it was headlined by that secondary. But have always really enjoyed Cliff Averill while he was playing, after he's been playing, because like his career, just like Cam, they both got their careers ended due to shitty neck injuries that
Mhm.
just prohibited them from playing. So I think both of them, because their careers got ended so short, want to, like, they've stayed in the game, and I think that they really want to. So those would, I would like to hire both of those guys and promote Hurt to DC. That would be my
Absolutely.
ideal scenario. But if we were to not hire Hurt, my favorite would be Terrell Austin or Vic Fangio. I'll leave it with that.
Yeah. I I mentioned this in the I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in the last podcast. The need for new mindsets. I look at all these old heads and I'm like, "God, Jesus, dude. I just pray to God that we don't do the same shit we've been doing, and we get that new fresh young minds. And even I was mentioning for head coach too, but I mean, I'm completely fine with keeping Pete. But now, speaking of that, I'm going to jump to this really fast for a hot second. Uh, this is essentially the last like step or straw for Pete, because if this DC doesn't work out, it's Pete on the line,
Mm-hmm.
100%. Because you can't put Shane; it's
Nope.
not his fault, and you can't put a DC, the new DC, whoever that might be, because it won't be their fault. So it's all because you're kind of figuring out who's the
Who?
bad guy in the
Yeah.
room, and there's
Who's
only
the
one left.
imposter, as you said? Yeah.
I did that for jokes. Don't bring
Mm-hmm.
that up again. So, and which is kind of bad, but at the same time, it's good because I hope Ken Norton was the was the was the
Yeah.
imposter. Jesus,
Otherwise, we will
I'm
our narrative will be proven wrong. In conclusion, I think that we can agree that Clint Hurt is the most likely and probably the best scenario for the Seahawks to promote to the defensive coordinator position. We hire Cliff Averill as his replacement on the D line, and then we hire Cam Chancellor to replace Andre Curtis as the defensive passing game coordinator. So, with all of that being said, make sure to subscribe, like, comment down below what you thought of this video. Make sure to follow us on Twitter. Make sure to follow me at Brayden Dowers, Show Me Baseball on Twitter. Make sure to follow Tino at Prime Bam Bam on Twitter. And I'll let Tino close this up.
Thank you for joining us today on this emergency quick podcast of the Seattle Seahawks. And go Hawks.